For centuries, the immense wealth of European nations depended entirely on a single overland artery, the Silk Road. Everything from spices to silk flowed from India and China straight into European markets, driving the entire continental economy. That pipeline slammed shut in 1453. The Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, seizing control of the trade route's western choke point. They imposed steep tax hikes on anything moving through, and Europe's economy quickly began to stagnate. Facing a financial squeeze, the Spanish monarchy decided to take a massive, expensive gamble. In 1492, they funded an ambitious sailor named Christopher Columbus, hoping he could sail straight across the Atlantic to find a backdoor to the east. Columbus didn't find a shortcut to India. He crashed into the Bahamas. Instead of a quick trade route, Europe had stumbled onto a massive landmass teeming with people, resources, and complex civilizations. The plan immediately shifted. With the Silk Road firmly blocked, the European powers stopped trying to trade with the East and started focusing entirely on extracting wealth from the West. Spain and Portugal moved quickly to monopolize this new territory. In 1494, they literally carved the ocean in half with the Treaty of Tordesillas, drawn a line down the map to split the uncharted lands between themselves. Armed with steel swords and firearms, Spanish conquistadors rapidly tore through established civilizations like the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. Their primary target was the vast stockpiles of gold and silver held by these empires, but the steel weapons were secondary to a much more lethal threat. The Europeans brought over diseases like smallpox, typhus, and measles. The native populations had zero immunity to these unfamiliar pathogens. This chart tracks the resulting demographic collapse. Through a combination of warfare, forced labor, and rampant sickness, the indigenous population plummeted from an estimated 50 million people down to just 8 million over the first 150 years. As the local populations collapsed, Spanish ships sailed back across the Atlantic, their hulls packed with thousands of tons of silver and gold extracted from the newly conquered territories. This sudden influx of precious metals made Spain incredibly rich. Watching their rival amass vast wealth, nations like Britain and France realized they needed to carve out their own pieces of the American continent if they wanted to survive. When the British and French arrived in North America and the Caribbean, the easy gold and silver were mostly gone. They had to pull their wealth directly out of the dirt, turning to lucrative cash crops like tobacco in Virginia and sugar in the Caribbean and Brazil. Cultivating these crops was brutal. Clearing dense forests, planting, and harvesting under a blazing sun required a staggering amount of physical labor to maintain the export volumes the European markets demanded. The colonizers initially tried to force the native populations to work the fields, but with disease and conflict already decimating those communities, the labor supply collapsed. To keep their plantations running, the empires turned to West Africa. They established the transatlantic slave trade. Over the next few centuries, ships transported millions of enslaved Africans across the ocean, forcing them into labor camps across Brazil, the Caribbean islands, and the North American coast. To satisfy an unending appetite for sugar, tobacco, and agricultural wealth, the European powers built their colonial economies directly on a foundation of industrialized human exploitation. This system operated under an economic theory called mercantilism. The ruling empires believed that the world possessed a strictly limited amount of wealth. To get rich, a nation had to export more than it imported, using its colonies solely to produce raw materials for the mother country. Because wealth was seen as finite, any gain for Britain was treated as a direct loss for France or Spain. The European powers violently protected their plantations, restricted their trade routes, and banned their colonies from doing business with rival nations. The Americas quickly turned into a proxy battleground. When conflicts flared up in Europe, they spilled across the Atlantic. Colonists attacked rival settlements, arming indigenous tribes and pulling them into the fighting as strategic allies. The tension finally peaked with the 7 Years' War. By 1763, the fighting ended with a decisive victory for the British, who seized nearly all of France's territory in North America, claiming Canada and the land east of the Mississippi. Britain had secured near total dominance over the continent's eastern half, but fighting a global war to protect that mercantilist machine came at an enormous financial cost, setting the stage for its own undoing. To win that war, Britain borrowed heavily. When the smoke cleared, the Crown stared down a debt of over £160 million, alongside the ongoing costs of managing a bloated American empire. Desperate to balance the books, King George III and Parliament decided the American colonies needed to foot the bill. They passed a series of direct taxes on everyday goods, pulling revenue straight from the colonists' pockets. This document is direct evidence of that extraction effort. These physical tax stamps from the Stamp Act proved the penny duty was paid. The colonists flatly refused to comply, fiercely objecting to being taxed by a distant government that didn't answer to them. Over the previous century, the colonies had built their own prosperous farms, bustling port cities, and local legislative assemblies. By the 1770s, the average settler enjoyed better land ownership and more direct political participation than most people back in England. They had developed a distinct, confident identity. The boycott of British goods evolved into armed rebellion and eventually a declaration of independence. The relentless drive to extract wealth from the New World created a society strong enough to break the very economic chains that built it.